Okay, it's 6 o'clock and welcome to a special meeting of the Sammamish City Council. Madam Clerk, would you call the roll?
Mayor Don Jaron.
Present.
Deputy Mayor Bob Keller.
Present.
Councilmember Tom Hornish.
Present.
Councilmember Kathy Huckabee. Councilmember Ramiro Valderrama.
Present.
Councilmember Christy Malchow.
Present.
Councilmember Tom Odell.
I'm here.
Okay, we are expecting Kathy. But in the meantime, Councilmember Odell, would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Sure. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Moved and second. Any comments? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? By your vote of 6-0, the agenda is approved. Next is executive session, which is for potential litigation pursuant to RCW 4230-110-1I. Mr. City Manager, how long do you expect it to take?
We are estimating 15 minutes.
15 minutes. Okay, we'll be going to executive session. Okay, we're back from executive session in less than 15 minutes, actually. Is there anybody that would like to address the council at this time? If there is, please step up to the podium. No? Yeah, public comment is closed. New business, it's an ordinance adopting interim development regulations as authorized by the Growth Management Act relating to the pilot program in the erosion hazards near sensitive water body overlay, providing for severability and declaring an emergency. Mr. City Manager?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Per council's direction, we are bringing this ordinance back to council for your consideration. Jeff Thomas, our Community Development Director, and David Pye, our Deputy Community Development Director, are here with a staff report.
Great. Thank you, Mr. City Manager. Good evening, council, and all those in attendance this evening. I'm Jeff, he's David, for those of you that don't know us. So a brief staff report. The ordinance specifically focuses on one section of code, Sammamish Municipal Code 21A 50225. This provision regarding the erosion hazard near sensitive water body overlay pilot program was originally adopted in 2013 as part of the environmentally critical areas chapter of code that was approved by City Council at that time. These provisions have never actually been utilized. The reason for that is they were also bundled up in amendments to our Shoreline Master Program, which I think all of you will recall at this point was a multi-year rigorous process that involved a lot of waiting, but that finally got resolved earlier this year with City Council action in February, and so all of those provisions, including the use of this section of code related to the erosion hazard near sensitive water body overlay, officially finally became effective on March 1st, 2017. So pursuant to your dialogue and direction last week, and working with the City Attorney's Office, we've prepared the agenda bill and the ordinance, fairly straightforward, that is in your packet, which essentially will adopt an interim regulation, and the interim regulation is essentially striking language in two different subsections of code, all under that 21A 5225, I believe subsections 3 and 5. And that would be valid for 6 months. Under state law, we're required to come back, and the City Council needs to have a public hearing within 60 days of the date of the adoption of an interim regulation, should you choose to do so this evening. So we've identified July 18th as the date for that. That would meet the 60-day test, and it would give us enough time to properly notice the public hearing. So the interim regulation, or the absence of these regulations, would be valid for 6 months. So in addition to having a public hearing on the action here this evening, potentially, we would also need to get working on the permanent regulation review process and do our work at the staff level, and then bring a staff recommendation to the Planning Commission And of course, then the Planning Commission does its own public hearing and makes a recommendation to the City Council on a permanent regulation in this case. So we would try and have all that done within 6 months. And it will be quite a bit of work, but we feel we have the capacity in talking with the city manager to undertake that work at this time and incorporate it into our work program. The basic difference, just a couple more comments and I'll turn it over to the mayor, but the basic difference in pilot program or no pilot program in this case is, Melanie, can you flip the screen on, please? Yeah. You've got that up. We're going to show you some information here. So the basic difference, what you see here is, I believe what you're looking at in the hatch areas are the erosion hazard near sensitive water body overlay, and then in that darkish red type color, that's the best information we have at this point. And David can speak to how that information came to be, but that's the no disturbance area, the dark red color. So it's almost like a sublayer within a layer itself, right? The overlay and then the no disturbance area. So the difference between having a pilot program and not having a pilot program is, with having a pilot program, development can be done on properties within the overlay and actually use the no disturbance area as development area, subject to specific regulatory requirements that are in our code currently. The City Council at the time in 2013 deliberated, I think it's fair to say, extensively over this, and ultimately put the pilot program in. If the pilot program is repealed, either on an interim or a permanent basis, development can still be done within the overlay, but the no disturbance areas have to be no disturbance areas. No development can occur within them. So the pilot program provided the opportunity, I believe, for a total of 4 projects, 2 using a tightline method for the conveyance of stormwater down to the lake, and the other 2 using, let's just call them advanced LID methods for managing stormwater on site. That pilot program provided the opportunity for 4 projects to occur, 2 of each, and then be reevaluated. So in essence, that's where we're at. Staff recommendation for this evening is for council to adopt the emergency ordinance with the interim regulation, repealing those couple subsections of code. The version of the ordinance we recommend you adopt is the version that was issued by the city attorney this afternoon, which I believe you all have hard copies of. It had a couple of clarifications, I think, and a few other minor adjustments. And then provide direction to staff to get working on a permanent regulation process, legislative review process. While we're doing that, we're certainly going to take a look for other examples, metrics, standards, any other type of information that we think would be useful in going through the permanent regulation process, that we can add value to that for not only our own work in drafting something, but then the work of the Planning Commission to review and make some recommendations to you, and of course you as council to make a final decision. So with that, Mayor, I will turn it back over to you, and David would be happy to answer all your questions.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. Okay, questions for staff. Number 1 would be Kathy.
Thank you. My question on the no disturbance area is, does that truly mean no disturbance, that no pipeline from, for example, in the overlay area, but then not in the non-disturbance area, that no tight line could go through there, that no electrical connections could go through there, no sewer connections or water connections can go through there, that it truly means that it is completely to remain undisturbed from any external factors?
Sure. David Pyle. And the answer to that is no. That does not mean that there are no disturbances allowed. There are some prescriptive allowances built into the code under 21A.50.225. There's a description of the range of activities that can occur within the no disturbance area within that section of code.
Do you have any examples from your memory banks? I don't want to push you if you can't remember. Yes.
Yeah, I'd want to take a look at the code again before responding to that.
that it? Okay. Deputy Mayor?
Thank you. I'm sorry, was not quite there. I'm curious about something. It's been 4 years since this was voted on and approved, and the discussions revolve around best available science. And since then, we've had new regulations, that NPDES, the LID regulations. Has there been anything in the last 4 years that stands out that may have changed, even with the way our regulations are in relation to the pilot program?
Yes, we do have more restrictive requirements and more thorough, I wouldn't say more thorough, but a different type of plan review that's done with projects that come in the door based on our NPDES code updates that occurred. So we do now use more, we rely more heavily on low impact development as a requirement for larger projects. Smaller projects that fall under the threshold don't have to follow the LID requirements. But in this case, if you had a larger project come in the door, you would be subject to a different set of requirements than you had been in the past in 2013.
Christie?
Thank you. So you just want comment or questions to staff right now? Okay. So, I mean, I guess it's important to note, like, I wasn't on the council, Councilmember Hornish wasn't, Deputy Mayor Keller wasn't, Councilmember Huckabee was not on the council, so I think that's why we have a lot of questions, and I've kind of brought this up. So one of the questions I have is, which came first, the underlying zoning that was there, or the overlay?
So that's a great question. We were not able to go back to prehistoric conditions in our research here over the last week, but we can confirm that under, correct me if I get this wrong, under King County jurisdiction, pre-incorporation, there was zoning on the property that we believe was R4, correct? Both parcels were R4. So we've got R4, R6 type zoning in the city, and then we've also got the SO 190 overlay. So those zoning probably predated the SO 190 overlay, we can guess, but coming into the city, we've got zoning that we adopted from King County, the 1999 zoning map, and then we've got the SO 190 overlay. In 2003, the city adopted new development regulations in October 2003 that have the erosion hazard near sensitive water body overlay in it. And then in December of 2003, the city adopted the Sammamish Comprehensive Plan, as well as a zoning map. And so the zoning on that 2003 zoning map, with the exception, I believe, of the town center for the most part, is largely still in place today citywide. And then, of course, as referenced during the introductory remarks, the 2013 ECA code updates, the environmentally sensitive areas code requirements, that followed then in 2013.
Okay. And staying on the topic of zoning, I went back to watch the meetings that occurred in 2013 just to kind of get myself up to speed. And one thing that came up that I don't think occurred, but I wanted to ask staff if it did occur was it was noted that to look at rezoning these areas specifically during the comp plan in 2015. Did that ever occur?
No, it did not.
Okay. And if not, is there a why not?
That's a good question. There were a number of things that were discussed by City Council at various points in some of my research, not in the last week, but just for other things that have come up over the last couple of years since I've been here. And I have not been able to identify a specific reason why or why not. Just going back to 2003 for a second, in other research I've done, there's also seemed to be some legislative intent by council in 2003 to actually initiate area-wide rezones back at that point in time, to the extent that there was actually some public noticing that was done for that, and that was never followed up upon either. So,
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe as a
I wish
council-
I Councilmember Malchow, I wish I had a better answer for you, but it's,
No, that's okay. I mean,
information is a little
I thought it was
sporadic, so-
interesting that it came up that we need to look at the zoning in these areas, the no disturbance zone, the overlays, but it hasn't happened. That may be something that this council body wants to move forward back to the planning commission as well.
right. So one additional thought on that. So the land use map, that's part of our comp plan, and our land use map and our zoning map are somewhat they have to be compatible with each other. Our land use map from 2003 is largely still in effect as well with, for these interim zone areas, they have a range of land use type designations associated with them, so.
Okay. And just one other note or question, just for as much for my edification as the folks that are here, is some of the zoning that is in these overlays is interim zoning. It's marked on our maps with pink outline as being interim zoning. And I don't know if you want to speak to how we came up with interim zoning.
Well, again, I think I may have indirectly touched on it in my last answer. That was adopted in 2003. And so the future land use map as part of the comp plan in 2003, as well as the zoning map, were adopted at the same time. So they are consistent with one another. The interim zoning on the zoning map does correlate to the future land use map of presenting a range of zone options. And again, I think there was some legislative intent by council in 2003 to initiate area-wide rezones to address those. And then it for one reason or another, it did not occur. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Mayor, if I may really quick, Councilmember Huckabee had asked a question initially, and I actually have the answer to that question.
Okay.
So we can maybe get that one off the books as well.
Oh, good.
So in the code, we've just taken a quick look at the code here, and there is a short list of permitted activities in the no disturbance area. Let me just find it here again. So development activities, this is just straight out of the code. Development activities may be permitted, so single-family residences with associated landscaping. So that's a situation where you've got one tax parcel to build one single-family home. Utility corridors, I think David may have mentioned that in his answer, to service existing development. And then there's some other language associated with that, but utility corridors, essentially. Streets providing sole access to buildable property and associated utility facilities. So that would be another allowance. And then public park facilities, including parking lots, restrooms, recreational structures, and/or pedestrian trails and sidewalks.
And I think one of the reasons I'm very much in favor of sending this back to the Planning Commission is that allows a lot of uses in that no disturbance area without a lot of real truing out on the ground or understanding what the implications are. And going back to the whole issue of the underlying zoning.
Is there another question for staff?
Oh,
or-
no, can I?
Well, we're just going through questions now, and then
Right,
we'll,
I was going to respond to what Christie said on the zoning.
oh, okay, go ahead.
That early on, since there was the overlay and there was no interest in building in those areas, and we have the combination, as you know, of the basin maps, and so it's a question of, do you do the basin maps first, or do you do the zoning first, and how do you true this property? And it's a fairly big and significant project, and there didn't seem to be any impetus to a requirement to move forward on that. So I think that can just kept getting kicked down the road. Some point, it's going to need to be done, and with a real understanding of what that land looks like and what is there.
Thank you. Tom Hornish.
Yes, thank you. So I want to make sure I understand and it kind of goes along the progression or the timing. King County did the zoning, then they put the overlay. And in the overlay areas, there are R1, R4, and R6s. Is that correct?
As best we can tell, correct.
Okay. With the overlay over top of an R4 or R6, without the pilot program, does that not effectively make it an R1 zone, even though it's zoned R4?
No, lower.
I mean, in a.
Oh, it's one per parcel. Yeah.
Sure. So in a similar fashion, just maybe using a parallel example for illustration, a property, a 1 acre piece of property is zoned R4, right? And it has a wetland and a wetland buffer on it. Changing to another example, you're right, you're not going to be yielding 4 lots on that because the wetland and the wetland buffer do not count towards calculating the developable density of the property. So yes, so similar to that type of example, you're correct.
So King County did a study and determined that in the no disturbance area, and I understand there's a no disturbance and then there's area outside the no disturbance, inside the overlay that can drain to the no disturbance, I think to Council Member Huckabee's question. But King County did, and my understanding is they did multiple studies to put the overlay on and effectively make it an R1, even though they had zoned it R1 and or R4 and R6 previously. Okay. When council in 2013 decided to say, we're going to change this and make an exception to what King County did after they did the study, did the 2013 council do any studies?
Yeah, the answer to that is, as part of the ECA critical areas update process, there were studies done. There are, as part of the cumulative impacts assessment and also best available science analysis, they had hired a geoscience professional to go through the body of science that supports protecting these types of areas from development,
okay,
with relationship to or focus on maintaining water quality in important key areas in the city, which is why we have the map in the areas where they are.
An erosion hazard overlay, yeah,
basically,
that we're
yes,
talking about,
yeah. And if I could clarify one thing, and I'm trying to clarify what Jeff was saying, is that it's important to note that the no disturbance area does not detract from the density that you could achieve on a property. Meaning that if you were to run the density calculation and you had 1 acre and you were to take out of 1 acre 30,000 square feet, in the case of a wetland, that's what would happen. But in the case of the no disturbance area, 1 acre is 1 acre. Just because there's a no disturbance area on it or an erosion hazard near sensitive water body overlay does not mean that detracts from the buildable density. What's going to be controlling in a situation like this is the geometry and the zoning controls in the fact that, and the product that a builder is trying to build. And they physically can't fit that number of units on a property outside of the no disturbance area. So it's not that they can't develop the
Wait,
property.
I thought you said they could put it on the no disturbance area.
Well, if there were no pilot program.
Okay, that's what I'm saying, though. I'm assuming there is no pilot program.
If there is no pilot program, what they would have to do is, say you had a piece of property and half of it was in a no disturbance area and half of it was out of that no disturbance area, you could still get the same number of units in theory, but it's really hard to fit those units in the area that's left outside of the no disturbance area. You'd have to set aside the no disturbance area in a tract, and you would not be able to develop within that area, but for crossings for utilities or maybe a road or something like that across it.
And when you say it's half and half, it's one parcel that's half and half.
In that, under that scenario, yeah. And the important thing there is that it's not so much the no disturbance area that's controlling the number of units, it's the space that's available to fit the number of units and where the builder is trying to fit those in a manner that's marketable to someone who's going to buy them.
Okay. So back to my question on the studies, and maybe you don't have the detail of that, and this is kind of where I think we're going, to be able to figure out what was done back then on those studies as compared to the King County overlay 20 years before, or 15 years before, or 17, 18 years before. And was there a discussion, do you know, at that time as to the interaction and the interplay between the King County study and the council studies that were done in 13?
My initial reaction is yes, and having watched the videos and read through some of the science, although I'd want to dig more into that to fully understand the consideration that was given to previous studies done by the county in relationship to the best available science document that was prepared by the city's consultant.
In 13?
In 13, correct.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. Okay, next question. We have one pilot program with two subparts, one with the tight line, one with the LID. The effective date of the tight line was not until March of this year upon DOE's Department of Ecology's approval of the SMP, Shoreline Management Plan. Trying not to use acronyms. It's hard. The lid, my understanding, and what I'm trying to ask is, what's your understanding of the lid program? Is that still available in this overlay? Or my understanding from watching the council, it became effective in 2013, and I believe the code says after the effective date of the pilot program, it's 2 years and then it expires. So I think the lid has expired. Is that your understanding?
My understanding in reading through the Shoreline Sammamish Municipal Code, section 21A.225, subsection 5, item B of effective date, says the terms of this pilot program in its entirety, item 5, related to pilot projects authorized under subsection 5.d.I of this section.
And that's the tight line.
That is, whereas item 2 is the LID component you're talking about. And to properties within the shoreline jurisdiction shall take effect following the adoption of the updated SMP, basically integrating the pilot program into the city's shoreline master program.
And I think then later on it says after 2 years after the effective date, the pilot program is to be stopped unless we want to continue it.
So if I'm hearing this correctly, is you're asking if item 2, which is the LID component of it, has since expired because it became effective at the date of adoption of the critical areas update.
Right. And I'm asking your understanding. I'm not asking you to give a legal opinion or whatever, but, well, let me ask.
So that's actually a good question, and that's actually something I think that we would want to talk with legal counsel on
Okay,
to
fair
get
enough.
you an answer certain.
So let me ask this question. Has anybody applied for an LID permit in this overlay area in 2013, 14, 15 after it became effective?
No, and I can also clarify that a little, is that if you read through the requirements of item 2, which is the LID program, it's a very high bar. It's really hard to meet, and it only allows for 10% impervious on the whole site, and you have to retain 65% of the site in a forested condition, and you have to design your drainage standards to a pre-forested condition, which is really hard to meet as well.
Yep, fair enough. All right, thank you.
Yeah. Councilmember Romero.
Yes. I think it's being lost here, and I just want to make sure everybody is aware, both here and at home, that these pilots did not just come up. This was a result of us doing the first environmental critical areas update, and we were one or second in the state that was doing it, where we were instructed to look at best available sciences and where might it be allowed. There were thousands of hours of testimony from consultants. There's at least 500 reports that should still be on the website with factual information citing from, as well as the public opinion that was thousands in there. So I don't want anybody to get the impression that this just popped out of there and surprised people. But this was years in the making, the process that was taking place, and it was thoroughly discussed, every one of the items, and verily discussed and viscerally discussed to go forward. So just that everyone is aware of the level setting, that this was a very intensive process that actually cost the city a lot of money, the citizens a lot of time, the Planning Commission and the council. Thank you.
That was a good question. I didn't get the answer.
True, isn't it?
You slipped that one in, didn't you?
But it was the passion.
Councilmember Odell.
Well, thanks, Ramiro, for the summary. I agree that there was an awful lot of discussion in the Planning Commission and in the council with an awful lot of back and forth. We spent an awful long time on this in the Planning Commission and then an even longer time in the council. So, Jeff, I do have a couple of questions for you. First of all, my recollection, and unfortunately I did not, because of things going on in my personal life, have time to go back and look at the tapes of the meetings. But my recollection was that ultimately we approved 3 and not 4.
Sorry? What, can you repeat that?
3 pilot projects, but not 4.
No,
2 of each kind.
Okay, I stand corrected. The other thing that's in my mind, and I need to, as I said, dust off some cobwebs here, is I came away from the discussion, and I was mayor at the time and leading this whole thing, so blame me.
Okay.
I knew you'd be quick on that. Was that by the time we got through with this thing, whatever pilot project would be capable of being designed and developed would essentially have the effect of, when looked at it in its entirety, wind up being R1 overall because of the things that were mentioned about having a certain amount of forested area or reforested area, this type of thing.
With or without the pilot program?
With the pilot program. So that you would have a situation where the pilot programs became very difficult to actually implement. Yet, as we're looking at it here, we have one thing in the wind that may have 30-odd lots on a very small number of acres. So how do we reconcile this?
So maybe to the first part of your question about the relationship between the pilot program and R1 density, that's not something I just conferred with David, council member, while you were speaking, and we don't have any recollection from going back and looking at the tapes of that specific dialogue or any sort of finding related to that. That's something we can certainly look for more extensively. But again, I think generally speaking, the way that we're understanding certainly the tightline option, I think David correctly characterized the other pilot option with having a very high bar that's set for the standard with the lid provisions. But the tightline option, again, the pilot program allows for development in the no disturbance area for something other than those 3 or 4 exceptions that I read in response to Councilmember Huckabay's question. So in terms of equating that to a certain density yield, I'm not sure it's possible to do. Sites may have other critical areas and critical area buffers on them, which may, tinker with any sort of density equating to a certain number. So I think any potential pilot program projects that the city would receive would be subject to a case-by-case evaluation to figure out what's possible and what isn't.
Okay.
And
I think the criteria for the evaluation would have worked against approval.
I'm sorry?
I think the criteria for the evaluation, in my recollection of the discussion at the time, would have made approval very difficult.
Would certainly make, it would, again, I think, set a bar for development that
And
the intent of the pilot program is higher than a regular type development.
Right, I'm agreeing with David's statement. Thank you.
Good.
Can I clarify one thing?
Sure.
And sorry to jump in. I think it's important to note that in the instance of, say, a project site that was in the R5 zone, or excuse me, R6 zone and R4 zone, possibly a site like that was 15 acres, that was proposing 30 dwelling units, that would be effectively R2. So that's just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, and I actually was going to ask the question, when did we convert from gross density to net density? Was that 2003?
2005.
2005. So it was after the first comp plan was adopted.
That's correct.
And so in essence, going from gross density, which was under the county, to net density, basically downzoned a whole lot of territory in our city. And so then the overlay, and the other point was you mentioned about best available science, but I ask you, is it best available science on that SO 190, the erosion hazard near sensitive water bodies? Is it best available science to draw the boundaries along parcel lines rather than geological issues? So
do you want my answer or his answer? They're going to be different. I'll give you my answer. So my answer to that is, it may have been a case that it was identified that there was likely going to be overlay on a specific tax parcel, and they may have drawn the boundary by tax parcel lines with the intent of capturing that parcel and then subject to more specific geotechnical or, professional review to identify then specifically where on that parcel it was located. That's my answer. You might have something better.
That's my,
I actually would have answered the same, that it would, for the purpose of land management, it'd be easier to draw the boundary of that at the edge of the, based on a parcel edge.
And the point was that, indeed, when we addressed the pilot programs, then it was probably mentioned that these overlays are rather crude, and if a developer wanted to develop a project, they could have the detailed study done to give the comfort level to staff that indeed it was developable in that overlay, or not.
Or not. Yep.
Or not, right. Okay.
Mayor, may I just, going back to one of Councilmember Hornish's questions regarding the effective date and the validity of possibly half of the pilot effort. In looking at this section of code a little bit more closely, I think it would be appropriate to request the city attorney's office to give us a legal interpretation of the language. Both sides of the pilot program kind of tie together under the same sentence in the same language about the effective date. So I think that's something we'd want our legal staff to take a look at to see how they're bundled or unbundled from one another, and we can come back to the council with a follow-up on that.
That's fair. I would look at the legislative history, the council meeting on July 9th for that, and I think it'll become very clear.
Okay, further questions for staff?
I've got one question.
Well, Councilmember Odell first, it looks like.
Oh, I'm done, thank you.
Okay. Councilmember Hornish.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of verify or understand the mayor's question on the overlay drawing is on parcel. What about the no disturbance? Is that on parcel or is that on geology?
The no disturbance is based on interpolation and interpolation of several factors: light refraction, lidar, soil maps. It is essentially based on the landscape setting where the property or where the land is located, the angle of aspect of that in relationship to the plateau.
So kind of
and
where the water would flow, right?
where the water would flow,
Yeah, okay.
and also the type of soils and the level of erosivity that those soils might have.
Okay, so it's not by parcel for the no disturbance?
It is not, and if you actually look at the definition in 21A 115 under erosion hazard near sensitive water body, the no disturbance area is defined under that definition, and it actually says in the definition that the map is only something to be maintained for the purpose of reference as to identify whether there might be a no disturbance area there, but that it is always subject to ground truthing and ground delineation, if you will.
Okay, I see no other questions, so I think at this point, I will go down the line on, if you want to comment, you're welcome to comment at this point before I would accept a motion.
Do we hit the buttons or you
Hit
just
the
gonna go
buttons. It looks like Christie hit it first.
straight? Are we going left or right? What the cuss?
Gotta be faster. Yeah, I think it's really important that we send this back to the Planning Commission to look at. I'll be honest, I didn't even know that the pilot project was still out there and available. So, and I do have concerns looking at these maps, and I don't want to sound dramatic when I say so, but I think we have to be cognizant of the area we live in. And a pilot project, by definition, lends itself, if successful in one area, to spreading. And I think understanding the best available science in 2017 will help for this council body as well as Planning Commission. I know that it was split 4-3 in the Planning Commission. In 2013, it was split up on the council that was an existing 4-3. So it's obviously a very contentious issue, and I understand why. But I do think it's really important that we have them study this, and I think this is very important.
Okay, thank you, Christie. Well, Councilmember Valderrama.
Oh, finally. Oh, thank you. As I mentioned before, there were thousands of hours that were invested into this project at all levels, from consultants, citizens in particular. Planning Commission and council members. That's all been documented, and that's all been put on the web, and so those are accessible for people to look. I think it's entirely appropriate that this be remanded back to the Planning Commission because it's now been 4 years. There have been updates that have taken place in ordinances, as we heard. We've also heard that there could be zoning changes. We also need to look a little bit closer at some of these properties. So I would want the Planning Commission to reassess these pilots and come back with us with recommendations. What I would ask for, and is different than it happened previously, and I had spoke out about it previously, the previous pilots that came to us all came with names. There was the Probes property, the Carson property, the Osgood property, the Gee property. I think it's more important that first the Planning Commission say, what kind of pilots do we want and where should those be? And then based upon that criteria, let's open it up if there is a desire to do that in a lottery basis versus the first come, first serve that I think was not fair when those names were coming at us. And so I would like that two-step process to take place, but would suggest that we bring it back to them and be able to look at. As far as the dangers there, two that I would bring up. One, with the mayor, we had raised the motion that there was going to be extra protection on Zaku's Creek, Ebright Creek, and what was the third one?
Pine Lake Creek?
Pine Lake Creek, that those, because of the kokanee and the importance of the kokanee, were also supposed to become, for lack of a better word, sanctuaries to allow the kokanee run. Second, the city has not had great history with developments in the erosion hazard area. I remind you of Northeast 20th, when we fixed that bridge, that cost us millions of dollars as that slid. The parking at Lake Sammamish parking, that cost us millions of dollars as well. So I think that those are things that we have to take much more seriously here in how we look at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Hornish.
Yeah, as a new council member, this was something that was on my radar, but when we did the critical area ordinance early last year or mid last year, I had kind of glossed over it. Shame on me. I thought the city had already issued 4 of these, and it was still code that was required to monitor the ongoing and seeing if it was working over the years and everything else. So bad on me for not bringing it up then. When we learned that it's still in there, it's like, wait a minute. If it's still available, that concerns me. And I do want to acknowledge the thousands of hours, man hours, I'm sure it was.
Women.
Yeah, I'm sorry. But I'm sure that there was a lot of time spent, and it was a close vote and everything. And I appreciate the answer to my question about studies back then, the best available science. But you know what? In 4 years, the best available science has changed again. So I think it's time that we relook at this. And maybe things have gotten tighter. I just don't know. So I'm kind of glad that it came back up, that we can look at it. Things that I would like to have looked at by staff and the Planning Commission as we go through this is with the new MPD, and I don't know what that stands for, I'm sorry, the new stormwater requirements, MPDES, but I don't know what does that stand for.
National Pollution Discharge Elimination System.
Discharge elimination. How does that impact, and how would it have been with that overlaying this pilot program that didn't come into effect until after the MPDES, that the pilot program allows only 60% of requires only 60% of the phosphorus to be removed from the development and the runoff from the cars on these streets in this area. So I want to better understand that new best available science from the NPDES and the requirements under a potential pilot program and what the requirements would be versus what we have in the code right now. Number 2, I know the lid requirements have changed. We just adopted a few, like 3 months ago, that now you got to do lid, even if it's more costly than economically feasible, you got to do it. I mean, that's not a reason to get out from underneath it. So how does that impact this pilot program? Number 3, I'd like to know if there are comparable cities dealing with these type of issues. With some of my research that I did over the last few days, there was somewhere, and I can't point where, I apologize, but I remember reading that there is no other analogous area that has to deal with these issues, with the steep slopes and the erosion hazards for and I forgot the designation of Lake Sammamish, but you know, it's 303D or 606D, 303D. it's sensitive, and a lot of cities don't have to deal with that. So if we can find comps, great. If we can't, we got to go back to the best available science today. And then number 4 is the whole zoning, and I think that's an underlying question. Even if we can get to a pilot program, does it make sense to have an R4, R6 inside of this? And in fact, during my research, there was a statement by the staff who is no longer here. There was a question asked, is there any R6 in the overlay? And the answer was no. And we know now that there is. So there was a little bit of misinformation that was happening back then. So I think it's time that it's good that we can go back and look at it, and I think we should.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Huckabee.
Yes. I think there have been a lot of questions broached tonight, and there have been a lot of questions in my mind. I do think that the zoning issue, early on, everybody felt that the overlays were very protective. Unfortunately, somehow those worked their way out of the code over a period of time, and it was at our last comp plan that citizens brought to us the fact that some of that language was disappearing and we needed to replace it. So that perhaps gave a false sense of security that things wouldn't happen if it was zone R20. It still wasn't going to happen. And I do remember one consultant saying, gee, yeah, you can build a nice tree house there. That's about all you can do. But the question of best available science and how things have changed, how LID has changed, how the stormwater recapture has changed, I think are really key. And we have, from my perspective, we did a tour of LID projects, and we saw that they were not always working well. So I would be really hesitant to have projects going forward if we don't tighten up those LID standards in terms of looking at them initially, monitoring them through construction, and having some monitoring going forward. There were real questions about what happens after this project is constructed. Does the HOA deal with it? Does the neighbor deal with it? Who manages it and who keeps that in place? I think even more critical if we put anything in those areas. So I think there are a lot of questions to deal with. First of all, defining whether we want to do the pilot projects, which pilot projects we want to do, what truly can and cannot go in the no disturbance zone. Because one of the things that I read over and over again, we need to reduce the impervious surface, yet our own standards, our own building standards require sidewalks. Is that something that should be changed for this particular pilot projects as we go forward? So lots of questions, and I'd like to see some of those answers come up through the Planning Commission.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Keller.
Thank you. Okay, I had mentioned this before. 4 years ago, there was an extensive body of work. Thank you, Councilmember Valderrama. This weekend, like all of my peers, I know, started looking at videos and realizing how many videos there really were on this dialogue and the volumes of information that you could read. And so the first realization is there was no way in one weekend we were going to be brought up to speed as to what this pilot program really looked like. And I want to be respectful of the body of work of the previous council, really, that came up with the motion. But it was 4 years ago. It was 4 years ago. And I may be redundant here, but I just want to go through that list again myself. Really, these are implementation questions, I think, that are really coming about. We're not challenging necessarily the science. The first thing is the best available science probably has changed in the last 4 years. And so I'm not saying that we reinvent the wheel, but we might want to look where there's some exceptions. The zoning is surprising that we find we have R4 zoning in a no disturbance area and the implications of that. And the fact of the matter is there are 7 miles of R4 zoning along the city of Sammamish on the west side that really has some complications. And so it's really worthy for us to go back and just look and take a look at that zoning and that conflict. In fact, I would also make the issue is if there are some things that are wrong, possibly we would look at some resolution or mitigation. I looked at the the SO-190. I started looking at that again this weekend, the original document. And they talk about TDRs that are possibly in there. Maybe there are some protections in that area that we should be looking at the transfer of development rights if that area is really critical. Just the delineation of the no disturbance zones, I think just in the quick conversation that we have, we probably need to have a little bit more rationale about how that, where that is. And then it is a danger possibly that we should just take some time. And so having said all that, I'd like to put a motion on the table to approve this, but I have a little different take than Councilmember Valderrama.
Can we wait until everybody has a chance to
But
input?
can I make a statement about,
That's deliberation, isn't it?
it is. Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Odell.
Thank you. At the risk of some repetition, there's been a lot of effort put into this subject by many people 4 or 5 years ago. If we look at this map, the no disturbance in the erosion hazard areas fundamentally are the whole west slope of our city. And I need to remind everyone that there is a 400 to 550 foot elevation change along this area. Stuff goes downhill fast, water goes downhill fast, and liquefied land goes downhill fast. We didn't have OSO 4 years ago, I don't believe. OSO has occurred since we had this last discussion on the pilots. One of the major points of discussion on the pilot projects was the risk issue, and that is, what would happen if there was a failure? Suppose 2 of them or 3 of them were just fine, but the 4th had some sort of major issue. Who's going to stand up and take the heat over that one? And frankly, I was one of the ones that didn't want to do that. So I voted against these, but I got outvoted. We have increasing development, increasing runoff, development's pushing its way into these areas because guess what? It's also view property. So that makes it all the more attractive for a developer to go after because you can command a premium price for it. The benefit to the city, though, is somewhat suspect of that because, yeah, the tax evaluation is higher, but in the long run, should we have a major slope failure during a period of heavy rain, we certainly have seen that this winter, and we've seen minor slippage around town, think Snake Hill, then we could be setting ourselves up for a very interesting situation as there's more and more impervious surface put into these areas and the drainage runoff, even if it's infiltrated, is more and more concentrated. So that gets into some very interesting situations. I am totally in favor of us taking another comprehensive look at this thing. I wasn't a real fan of this ordinance when it was passed, although I wound up voting for it in the end because I felt that some of the restrictions that have been put on the development would effectively mitigate some of the damage. I would like to think that vote was still justified, but I'm not sure that it is. And I think it's time to take another look. My 2 bits.
Thank you, Tom. I'd like to address the two council members had talked about OSO, but we're talking about erosion hazard here. We don't have an overlay showing slide areas. When we're talking about erosion hazard, we're not talking about OSO conditions. This is simply erosion and basically cloudy water going into the lake. That's what we're talking about. So to bring up OSO or other slides, I think is disingenuous at this point. Now, when an individual pilot project comes to staff, if there are steep slopes or questions about slides, certainly staff would bring in best available science. And the other comment about best available science advancing, well, I'm not sure best available science has really advanced. It's simply, it's there. It wasn't really dealt with when we put the pilot programs in. We said, well, this is pretty crude science that we have in these maps. The best available science will come when a pilot project is proposed, and staff will apply best available science to review it. And so indeed, if the requirements are stricter now, I would expect staff to be stricter in their review. So in fact, staff mentioned that the map was for reference purposes only. And so the intention is that if a project is proposed, you can look at the map and say, oh, there's a no disturbance zone there. Let them hire a geologist or whatever scientists that they have to, and then convince staff that indeed it's all right to disturb it there. It won't be deleterious to the environment. And everybody has said how much time we spent going through this some 4 years ago. Well, now we're talking about doing the same thing, and staff can say, yes, we can handle it. But I also have heard that staff is overworked now. And not to mention the Planning Commission and the Council, we have a whole lot of important plans that we want to get done this year, or at least get into them pretty deeply this year for various reasons. And so to revisit something that was thoroughly and exhaustively addressed 4 years ago, and revisit it simply for maybe one project, because at this point, if indeed the LID ones are off the table, then we're only talking about one at a time project, and then there's time to review how that project did in the pilot program before you allow a second one. So to go through all that staff work and time to accomplish what? I am going to be against bringing this up at this point, and I see I have some more buttons though. So is there more discussion before a motion?
Yes.
More discussion? Okay.
I wanted to bring the motion.
No deliberation.
Okay. More discussion, Councilmember Odell?
Sorry, left it on.
Okay. Councilmember Hornish?
I respectfully submit to you that if you have a landslide, there's muddy water going into there's muddy side of the hill going into the water. That's all I have to say.
But if you don't have a landslide, you could still have the muddy water from erosion.
I hear that.
Okay. Councilmember Malchow?
Yeah, I was going to touch on the same thing, but failure on the pilot program was defined specifically as erosion or a landslide, actually. And I did want to bring up one thing as I went back through here and looked at this, and I'm going to give Mary Wichter credit for asking that we have maps that overlap so that you can put more layers on. I mean, I'm forced to go out to King County GIS to do that, but then I don't get our zoning maps and the benefit of some of our maps. It would be really helpful in looking at stuff like this, especially when it comes to zoning, to have maps that overlap to be able to, I'm guessing otherwise on stuff, which isn't probably a healthy exercise. And then the last thing I want to say is as much effort and energy as went into this before, new councils always have the right to revisit previous policy. Oftentimes we are put into office to do that very job because people don't like what's going on. And I think that's what this is. This is an opportunity for a new council to do new policy.
David, do you have a comment? No? Okay. Kathy, do you have another comment?
I just have another comment, Don, and it's
Okay.
to you, because we're not looking at the landslide hazardous area here. We don't know if some of these areas are landslide hazard. I know that there are landslide hazard areas in the community, and they are on people's deeds. But again, you said that this is not OSO. We don't know if it's OSO because we're not looking at the map that says the landslide hazard areas.
I think the point is if it's landslide hazard, I would assume that staff would be aware of that and wouldn't allow development in the landslide area. Okay, well, I accept what was said about new councils taking up projects again. I just hope that staff can figure out where to find the time to address this if this goes forward. So at this point, I would, okay, Deputy Mayor Keller.
Great. I'd like to make the motion and then speak to it for just a moment. So the motion is to move to approve the proposed ordinance as amended by the City Council and sent to City Council earlier today, declaring an emergency, adopting interim development regulations, removing the erosion hazards near sensitive water bodies overlay, no disturbance area pilot program from Sammamish Municipal Code 21A.50.225 as detailed in Attachment A, and setting the matter for further discussion at a public hearing on July 18th, 2017.
Second.
Moved in second, discussion. Councilmember Valder, oh, you
I'd
want
like
to speak to it
my-
first? Okay,
my
go
motion
ahead.
first. I'd like to acknowledge the fact that I agree with Councilmember Valderrama regarding ultimately this may go back to the Planning Commission, but I would suggest that we actually have a second step or a first step in there, that we give some direction to the staff previous to assigning this anywhere. And in fact, I could read a comment about direction to the staff. As part of the full legislative review of this matter to adopt permanent regulations, the City Council directs staff during the next 6 months to research and evaluate other possible examples, metrics, and/or standards which may assist staff in drafting proposed permanent regulations, the Planning Commission in formulating recommendation, and City Council in making a final decision. Why I'm saying that is I think the mayor has made a good point that staff is overburdened, but I'm not sure that we want to just take the overburdened part of staff and put it onto the Planning Commission and spend a lot of time when we really should probably look at what the framework is of the work that we want them to do if it's going to go to the Planning Commission. So we should take that interim step of having staff give this direction. So that's my comment.
Councilmember Valderrama.
Yeah, I support that, and in the ordinance, as you just read, it does have to go back to the Planning Commission, and as Mike Kenyon had mentioned last week, it will go back to the Planning Commission for a reassessment. I would ask that in the evaluations that we do look at the criteria as new best available science, but what was important, and I thought they made a good attempt, was the evaluation forms that were utilized last time. I thought that those were very beneficial for the council to come back and look at those quads and be able to work through those, so I would ask that they do that. And again, as I've asked many times, that we have a success statement before we give it to the Planning Commission, because we tend to come back and undo a lot of work that doesn't need to be done if we were in sync to begin with. Thank you.
Okay, any other comments? Then we have, Councilmember Odell.
Yeah, I'm supportive of Councilmember Keller's recommendation on modifying the motion. One thing I would like to request, if we are going to send this to the Planning Commission, that in addition to defining the criteria we'd like them to look at, that the leadership of the council and the leadership of the Planning Commission meet monthly on progress on this issue.
No surprises when it comes back, huh?
Yeah.
That's a good point.
I'd just like to make a clarification.
Go ahead.
Just a clarification on the direction to the staff really is for the staff to look at what we talked about tonight and really for them to come up with a plan. When they may come back to us, and it's possible that we may change and it not go to the Planning Commission. Honestly, I mean, there may be something that they bring to us. I'm just like the staff to take the first bite at looking at this before we just assign it to the Planning Commission and have them report back to us as what the best direction would be for us to take. I think that's what I was trying to establish with the direction to the staff. So it may go to the Planning Commission right after this, it may not.
Mr. City Manager, do you want to make a comment on that?
Yes, why don't we as staff take a week or so and reflect upon what we've heard tonight, and then come back to you with a proposed plan of action. I think that would be probably prudent on all of our parts.
Just to clarify, though, I thought 2 weeks ago or whatever it was, last week, it has to go to the Planning Commission.
It does.
It does.
It does have to go.
Eventually, it would.
must.
It
Eventually
must.
it will,
Yes.
okay, okay.
That's why I put my button on, because I'm very confused by the statement. It sounds like it may go to the staff, and the staff may say,
No.
oh,
No,
this is
that-
good, or this is bad, and it doesn't go to the planning commission. But, so I want to understand exactly what it is we've asked for, because my understanding is that it has to go to the planning commission to come back to us.
Should we add an amendment?
Well, what,
That up, I think, Don. Any amendment from what we have now, that is, anything that comes forward as a permanent development regulation will go to the planning commission. The only circumstance where the planning commission would not be involved is if the council simply lets this interim regulation expire. And if that happens, then the current pilot program is back in effect.
Question for council. Lets it expire, or if they make another action saying, we're going to cancel
What we did today.
what we did today.
No change.
So you can repeal it sooner than that.
Right.
so really, what I'm really looking at is that the staff helps clarify the framework of work before we jump down the road, because I know everybody has spent time looking at this, and there are so many different approaches that it would be nice to actually have a framework that we were talking about before we pass it on.
Well, of course, the simplest would be not to go down this road, but anyway. The question's been called. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. By your vote of 6-1, it is approved. And that's ordinance 2017-438. Is there any other, did we do the order? Nothing?
Adjournment.
No. We're adjourned.